Welcome, everybody. I am Jackie Benestante, and I'm the director at the Autism Society of Texas. We're really glad to have you all today. We are talking about diagnosis of autism in adults, but a lot of this is probably going to apply at any age or later diagnosis, because we get a lot of calls to our Navigating Autism team about people who suspect they have a diagnosis or think they might have autism. And so it can definitely be challenging later as a teen or an adult to figure out and navigate that. And so Dr. Loveland is going to kind of walk us through that and explain all that to us. And Dr. Katherine Loveland has a very impressive background, and we're really, really honored to have her. So she is Landmark Charities Professor of Autism Research and Treatment, tenured in the departments of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and Pediatrics at the University of Texas McGovern School in Houston. She's also the training director with UT Health Doctoral Psychology Intern Program, and that's APA accredited from July 2016. She is also the director for the Center for Human Development and Research, the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences with University of Texas McGovern Medical School in Houston. And this is how we had become familiar with Dr. Loveland from the CLASS Clinic. So she is the director of the UT Health CLASS Clinic, which stands for Changing Lives Through Autism Spectrum Services, Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, also with University of Texas McGovern Medical School, Houston. So we're really honored to have her today. She's going to present her slides. And then we'll have time for Q&A. And Leslie Jackson, our social worker, is also monitoring Facebook. So we're going to ask that if you have questions for Dr. Loveland, please post them in the Google form, and I'll read the questions out to Dr. Loveland at the end. So you don't need to put all your personal information and everything else on Facebook. So just fill it out in the Google form so you can maintain your privacy. And we will ask Dr. Loveland anonymously for you. And of course, our staff's always available to help for any autism related questions. So Leslie will be posting that on Facebook as well. And at this time, I am going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Loveland. And Dr. Loveland, I think if you're ready, I'll let you go ahead and begin.
Thank you so much, Jackie, and I appreciate your kind introduction. Well, thanks for inviting me here today, and I'm really happy to see everyone on the Facebook Live, and I hope we'll be able to provide you some good information today. I have been working with individuals on the spectrum since 1980. I know I just dated myself, but there it is. And in the last 15 years or so, I've been focusing primarily on people who are adults or adolescents who come undiagnosed and who might have autism or might not, and who also may have other things. And I find this work tremendously rewarding. I love my people in my clinic, and you'll probably be able to see that enthusiasm as we go on. Okay, I want to say first how I have come to understand autism, in part from talking to hundreds and hundreds of people who can tell me about their experience and what it is like. First of all, autism spectrum is not like a static condition that comes down, sits on a child, and remains the same throughout the person's life. It's a developmental process that changes as the person goes through their life and develops and grows. It's not a disease. It's not something to be cured or made to disappear. It will present some challenges usually, but it also can present some benefits for the individual. I think of it as a developmental difference. It's kind of like having, as I say here, brown eyes or flat feet or being tall. It's just a part of who you are. And it continues through life, developing along with the person as you gain experience and your brain develops and lots of things happen. And this is especially important to know. All the characteristics we see in people on the spectrum are actually distributed through the whole human population. Did you know that? And so we don't call it a diagnosable condition unless all of them line up with the definition that we have medically, and they're causing enough problems in the person's life for us to look at it that way. So I think of autism as part of the human spectrum. Now, the people who make it to adulthood without being diagnosed. Well, most of the research is on children. We're only now starting to get some on adults, but we do have some evidence that adults on the spectrum have a variety of problems with life adjustment. Most of the studies have been on people who were diagnosed in childhood, and many of whom also have intellectual disability. So they're a somewhat different population that I'm going to be mostly talking about today. Because I'm going to be talking about the people who are intellectually able and verbal and have many skills. And this sometimes, although it's a good thing, it sometimes helps to prevent them from getting an accurate diagnosis early enough in life for them to get what they really need. Okay, it's worth saying that adults with autism want the same stuff that everybody wants. You know, there's this idea out in the community that people who are autistic aren't interested in relationships, that they don't want to, you know, they don't have any empathy, or they don't want to relate to people, and they just sit in the corner or something. Of course, this is not true. 99% of all the people I see definitely want relationships. They may have trouble with relationships, but they want them. They want to be independent, productive, members of their community, and most importantly, they want to be accepted and liked for who they are without having to try to change themselves into someone else. I always tell people, my goal in treatment is not to change you into somebody else, but to help you be yourself in the most successful way, and to help you have the best possible quality of life. So why are people coming in to be diagnosed? Quite a few of my clients, particularly those who are over 30, come in and say, you know, I've always known I was kind of different. And I've gotten to a place in my life where I want to understand myself and know what's going on. Many people have been telling themselves all their lives, I'm a bad person, there's something wrong with me, no one will ever like me. And this is, you know, this is really bad for you to keep telling yourself that. So for those people, understanding where all these diverse parts of themselves come from can be very healing. Some people notice similarities with a recently diagnosed relative. Like, oh, I'm a lot like my nephew, or maybe it's their child. Sometimes it's a parent. Families, whether it's the family of a young adult who is still living at home, or a partner or spouse of an adult who's more independent, may get frustrated. And so I've had quite a few spouses or partners bring, you know, their partner in and say, please do something. We can't seem to resolve these problems, and I think he might have this, or I think she might be doing this. So, you know, if the person is correctly understood and all the pieces are put together, it can help save them from being blamed for stuff that they can't help, or that is a permanent part of them. And it helps keep them from getting negative labels, generally, like laziness. Also, if there are mental health problems, emotional difficulties, those are best going to be understood if we know the developmental course of the person. It makes a big difference. You know, if a person has a lot of outbursts, sometimes they get the label, oh, he must be bipolar, or she must have a personality disorder. Well, no. And you can have those things along with autism, but that's the minority. Most of the time it's overwhelm, emotional or otherwise. And so it takes a person familiar with autism to notice, oh, that's what's happening. And of course, it's going to affect how you choose to work with the person and what they need. Okay, so how do people get missed? Why do people make it to adulthood or late adolescence and no one has noticed? Diagnostic overshadowing. You know, there's something, ADHD, for example, is usually the first diagnosis that people get as a child. a lot of pediatricians give it if the child is not responding to the parent's directions or something. And that doesn't mean that ADHD isn't present, just mean, it might not be the only thing. If developmental milestones were met, child's developing on schedule, maybe he's reading early, so the pediatrician will say he'll grow out of it. I don't mean to dump on pediatricians, but most of them don't know this. If the person has a clear desire to interact socially, or is affectionate, and a great number of young people on the spectrum are interested in interacting, but they may get it trained out of them because their environment involves a lot of people who are unkind to them. Some cases you don't see more clear behavioral signs like flapping or something. There might be other types of repetitive behaviors that are not as obvious, so that gets overlooked. A big one is that no professionals are around who have the expertise to diagnose, or the family doesn't seek diagnosis for any number of reasons. If the child performs well in school, has good grades, is really bright, both the school and the parents may overlook autism spectrum symptoms. I've seen way too many young people who are regarded as a brain on a stick. Wow, look at the great grades my child is making. Yeah, but your child is miserable because of X, Y, and Z also happening at school. Signs could be mistaken for other conditions. I mentioned that. Sometimes people around the child do not, or the young adult, don't want to have the diagnosis. It could be, like we don't want this in our family. We don't want that label. Or the young person may say, I already feel different. I don't need a diagnosis to make it worse. A fear that they will be labeled or singled out or rejected because of a diagnosis. Co-occurring behavioral disorders, by which I mean mental health, tend to occur a lot in the population of people with autism. And the more the older they get, the more them they have and the more difficulties they produce. And so as these issues become prominent and as the demands on the person increase with increasing age, we begin to see a focus on things like, well, let's treat the ADHD, or let's treat the depression. Okay, it's fine to do that, but it may delay or prevent looking for the possibility of autism. And I see this one a lot. Really bright people who are so adept at adapting. It's quite adaptive to do what they do. I mean, they find ways to work around challenges, and it's a great deal of effort in most cases. But then there may be other things that are, they get to a certain point and their ability to work around the challenges is no longer enough, or the ability in certain areas, like say academics, is out of keeping with other areas. Like, well, she's doing so well in college, but she hasn't learned to drive a car. Why not? Or she doesn't know how to do laundry, or she doesn't have any friends. So why is that? Women. I get a lot of women in my clinic, and they may present differently from an early age, and they are often a little more obviously social, not always, but often, and they may be like boys and girls generally, they may be a little less have a little less tendency to be disruptive. And so if they're not making a fuss, the school's not interested. And the parents may not know what's happening. Certainly, there is a tremendous lack of people trained to identify autism in older people. I cannot tell you the number of people, had a new one this morning, who come in and say, well, my psychiatrist or my neurologist or my GP told me, oh, you couldn't possibly have autism. You're too social. You make eye contact. You're funny. You're creative. You do all these things. Well, of course, there's a lot of people with autism who have those characteristics. You have to dig a great deal deeper to understand the lifespan of the person and what it costs them to appear as typical as they do. So a lot of people get blown off by both mental health and other providers. Professionals and family members may think that looking into autism is some kind of an excuse or a weakness. And I mentioned the masking, substituting learned behaviors, which is a great deal of trouble to do, especially all day long. I never forget the man who told me when I asked him about his apparently good eye contact, "Oh, I don't look at your eyes, I actually look at your nose," which is highly adaptive, actually. And of course, employers and HR departments can be a problem because they may refuse to believe that an adult has autism, or they may be completely in the dark about what accommodations might be necessary. Okay, children who are not identified early. Well, what happens to people if they're not identified? Well, they don't get the services they need. They don't get supports for socializing with peers. They don't get accommodations. Often they are punished for behaviors that they cannot help. And that really breaks my heart. I've heard a lot of stories about that. Interestingly, they may not get the medical attention they need. And this actually goes on into adulthood. I know plenty of people who have, kind of odd illnesses, but once you really go into looking at it, they can be diagnosed, but they get blown off by doctors. Why? Often because they don't express themselves in a typical way, or they become anxious when they go in and see the white coat and have basically stage fright. So, for example, I've seen quite a few people now who have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a hypermobility of the joints syndrome, and it has other things attached to it that may be problematic. GI disorders are very common, and doctors need to listen to people who have autism. They do this to old people too. People are at high risk for bullying, exclusion, and other mistreatment throughout life. And of course, everybody is at higher risk if they have burdens such as family poverty, racial inequities and opportunity in medical care, discrimination, all kinds of things that may be present and just add on top of the burden. And as I've noted, these things persist into adulthood. The people I see in adulthood, generally by the time they get to me, have had many years of severe stress. They may not know that that's what it is, but it is severe stress, rejection, bullying, struggling in school. Sensory sensitivities is a huge one, and people don't understand this. I had a lady who worked in a call center for a large retailer and in a cubicle farm, which is absolutely the worst for her because she has sensitivity to noise. And every now and then, since they were sort of supposed to be selling stuff, they would get all the people to come out and have a sort of a pep rally. And she had to get a letter from me to get accommodations to not attend that, because you can imagine screaming and shouting and all that, terrible. So the sensory environment of work or school or going to the grocery store, all these things can be extremely stressful, and loneliness too. People don't think of people with autism as getting lonely, but of course they do. Okay, so over time, what happens? We get increasing signs of mental health problems, and that is also another issue. Very often families have a lot of difficulty understanding what's happening, say with a young adult, and they may have misplaced expectations for their young person. Oh, he's going to be a doctor. Well, maybe he doesn't want to be a doctor. Or the kind of pressure you have in medical school is not a good fit. So sometimes families have to give up their dream of who this is going to be and let their adult child be who she or he wants to be. Lack of peer relationships. They get, I see this often, young people who did really well in high school, and then they get accepted to a college that's away from home, and all of a sudden, all their supports have been removed. And they have to not only deal with a lot of strange people and a strange environment with new routines, but they have, have to take care of things like their food and their laundry. They might have a roommate. The academic level has ramped up. It's a recipe for complete overwhelm. And the anxiety often leads to severe depression and staying in the room and not going to class. And unfortunately, then the person bounces back and feels terrible about themselves. So there's things we can do about that, but it's something that families need to be aware of. I often recommend start with community college, take a few courses and live at home for the first year or two. Do it in graduated stages. Young adults frequently live at home well past the age when their peers are independent, and they feel ashamed of this very often, but sometimes not. But their families are often confused by it. Autistic adults are, and of course younger people too, are at risk for legal involvement. I hate to say that, but it is true. I've seen too many people who make poor choices of friends and get pulled into activities that are harmful to them and others. They get pulled into risky behaviors, substance use. They get pulled over for, being in the wrong lane or having a burnt out tail light, has happened to one of my clients, and they have a meltdown with the police, and the police think they're resisting arrest, and they get arrested. There are also individuals who are so lonely that they become addicted to pornography. I've had clients who were, charged as sex offenders, and they may or may not be sex offenders, but they sometimes have poor judgment about what is a suitable way to get your need for connection. The older people I see, and I get people in their 60s and 70s too. So we've talked about people who grew up a long time ago. They've usually had no supports at all. They've had more exacerbated mental health issues with hospitalizations. They've probably been diagnosed with stuff they don't have and given treatments that haven't helped. It's worth mentioning that many medication treatments for mental health and other things don't work in the usual ways with people with autism. Why? Because it's a full body developmental difference. And some people get paradoxical reactions. They're agitated by something that's supposed to make them feel better, or various other bad side effects. So treatment with medications has to be done very carefully. Knowing that the person has that risk is really helpful. Adults may or may not be employed. I'm always delighted when I see people who found a good job that suits them. And the luckiest ones are the ones who can turn one of their intense interests into a job. And not everyone can do that, but many do. And when they can, and if they have a work environment that's conducive to them, yay. Many of my clients have or have had a partner or spouse, but they're usually struggling in relationships. Unfortunately, they are at high risk for abuse by partners, especially if they are female. So I had countless female adults tell me about abusive situations and relationships they've been in. Many of my clients have children, and quite often their children have autism. And so you may have an entire family with autism. So it's important, even if you are a specialist working with young people, children below 18, adolescents, there's a good chance one or both of their parents have at least significant features. So it's very helpful to understand what their concerns might be and how they might be thinking. And again, older people are at risk for legal involvement too. Research suggests that intellectually able adults on the spectrum are 3 times more likely to have no regular daytime activities than people with intellectual disability. Why would that be? Well, possibly because there are no programs for them. And maybe they haven't been diagnosed. And if you have an intellectual disability, the state knows what that is. They may not always have everything you need, and you might be in a waiting list this long, but they do recognize it. Only about a fourth of intellectually able adults, at least in the research I've seen, are competitively employed. That's not good. And tends to be worse for women. One of the things you also see is a lot of people who do really well at education, but then when they get out of the education that they've had, they have trouble making a career related to that. Like maybe they have a law degree, but like the client I mentioned from years ago was working in the call center. Or they have a business degree in finance, but they can't do the actual job. So having a degree in something is not equivalent to being able to do the job. So many bright people are underemployed. And sometimes it's because they've picked a field where they can do the work in the classroom, but when they have to do it out in the world, the conditions are different. John Elder Robison published in Autism Research in 2019 the following statement: recent studies of mortality, illness, and suicide among autistic adults paint an alarming picture. Autistic people appear to die much earlier than the general population, and they seem to be far more vulnerable to a surprising range of medical problems. Yes, this is true. Suicide and depression seem far more common than in the general population. Well, I don't know about that, but it is very common anyway. If correct, that suggests an older autistic population in silent crisis with few, if any, supports. Very true. If so, older autistic people should be a focus for public health and human service agencies. I'm still waiting for that. Although there are some steps. So what are the things that keep people stuck? Financial limitations, particularly with younger adults who have not gotten out of the family home. They want to get out of the family home, perhaps, but they can't because the family can't pay for an apartment and they can't pay for someplace to live. Sometimes adults who are older have this problem as well. Difficulty with activities of daily living, that for various reasons I'll mention, they have not mastered. Grooming and other self-care tasks can be challenging if it just doesn't kind of reach the top of their list. One of the characteristics that many autistic people have is if it's not interesting to them, it makes it really hard to do it. So bathing and toothbrushing, if it seems pointless, might not get done. Taking medication, making their own doctor appointments, may also be hard. Social isolation living alone a long time can be very lonely, and in other words, living without friends outside your family can tend to make people isolate themselves even more. Now, many young adults are not yet ready to separate from their families. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that later, but delays in social emotional development mean that they are just not ready. Transportation is a big one. About half of my young adults do not drive. Some of my older adults do not drive. Although most of my older adults, have had to learn to drive. Interestingly, those who do drive are usually very careful, rule-following drivers. But many of them tell me that they have trouble with spatial perception and anxiety because of things coming at them, or they have trouble navigating, or they have trouble integrating visual and auditory information and motor movements. So it's kind of a setup. I like to suggest a gradual transition to independence that starts early. Employment. Oh, I could go on about this. This is a slide I made for the Autism Speaks employment think tank a long time ago. Interviews. This is a problem throughout ages, although people do tend to acquire skills to get around this as they get older. There's certain things that interviewers may expect that the person may not know, like what does it mean when they say, have you worked with a team? Well, almost everybody's worked with a team of some sort, but the person might say no and stop there. So they have to be coached to expand on, well, yeah, I was working at a team when I was in a team when I was working on that grocery store because I was part of the vegetable department and there were several other people in that department, and here's how we handled it, whatever. Disclosure. If I'm interviewing for a job, should I tell the interviewer that I have autism? People that fear being discriminated against or excluded or stereotyped, and they have reasons for that. On the other hand, at times disclosure can help explain some issues in the interview process and also can be an aid in requesting accommodations. Underemployment, I mentioned before, adults who are in a job may need clear and very specific job expectations with instructions for steps. And if they don't get that, somebody may say, well, you're asking too many questions, or why don't you know to do that? That's obvious. Well, it isn't obvious to them. So it's important that supervisors have some understanding of the person and to be able to interpret them differently, not as rude, slow, asking too many questions, being overly emotional, etc. Social relationships on the job, boundaries, things like that, how to deal with disagreements or conflicts or departures from routine or expectations can be difficult, and these are areas where people often get upset or stressed out at work. And then good old sensory sensitivities. A lot of things can occur in this area, and these sensory sensitivities can be overwhelming. They can make the person feel very anxious, and the more anxious they get, the more sensitive they are to the sensory things, and it is a vicious cycle. Mental illness. Now, this is something people often don't talk about, but is very, very common in people on the spectrum. Some of the literature suggests rates from 40 to 70%. I would think it's a little higher, at least in clinic populations. I don't know about the population at large. Children are often diagnosed with anxiety disorders. Even infants and toddlers on the spectrum have more of those symptoms. So the number of children and adults who are taking some kind of psychotropic medications keeps going up over time. Not always productively, but it does. So when a person's in adulthood, sometimes the mental health issues and executive functioning issues, which I will get to, can be more of a problem than the autism itself. So executive functioning, some of you are probably familiar with this term. I call it the air traffic controller in your head. It's a constellation of related cognitive things that help us organize, pay attention, remember stuff, initiate action, complete tasks, all kinds of things. and it does what an executive does in an organization. So this is an area where very, very often people on the spectrum have difficulties in one or more of the areas. Very often they can qualify for a diagnosis of ADHD. Not always, but often. So I've listed some of the things that we often see in people on the spectrum related to executive function. So executive functions can complicate treatment and increase the risk for other mental health conditions. Here are some of the other effects of having significant executive functioning problems. Your social relationships can be affected. The impulsive child, gets rejected by peers and may be victimized, for example. Mental health can be affected. If your executive functioning deficits are affecting how you perform at work, then that's going to be very discouraging. Other cognitive skills, working memory limitations, the ability to, like if I gave you a phone number and you had to cross the room and go type it into your phone, that's working memory. And if you have trouble with that, you can actually have trouble with reading comprehension because you forget what you just read as you're reading further. Many people tell me about they have that. Social emotional awareness can be affected. If your cognitive style is such that you take in information from one thing at a time, then integrating information from different sources can put too high a load on your executive functioning. And so sometimes that leads to looking at one part of the face, but not another part of the face, or listening, but not looking at the face. I had a man tell me once, could you say that again? I was looking at your right eye. So yeah, I thought that was a great example of that. I mentioned driving before shopping. A very important basic adult skill. If you are going to the store and you're being hit with all kinds of sensory stuff and you are having to remember what to get, and then there's somebody over there doing a food demonstration, pretty soon you get pulled off task and you forget what you were doing there, and you might get overwhelmed too. So the more cognitive load you have, the harder it is. And so this is just a summary slide of some of the contributors to difficulties in life adjustment in adults on the spectrum. And, people think, oh, that's because they have autism. Well, sort of. The primary social communication deficits are definitely part of it, as are sensory perceptual and motor differences that accompany autism and seem to be part of it. And the narrow interests and motivation, which I think are connected to with executive functioning over here. And then you got mental illness that accrues over time, adverse experience and stressors that accrue over time, and medical illness, which is kind of a wild card because there could be any number of things going on there. Now, young adults, I often tell families that in my experience, frequently young adults are emotionally and socially 5 to 7 years younger than their actual age. So if you are 21, you might be, 14 to 16 on the inside, at least in some areas of your functioning. Now, if you're 14, are you ready to leave home? No, you don't want to because you're not there yet. Unless your home is a hellhole, you don't want to leave. So this leads to a sort of mismatch between the social and other things. And by social, I'm including also culturally conditioned expectations for the age. Like when you're 21, you're supposed to be able to do things like, make yourself a sandwich, take your own medication, wake up on time, things like that. A lot of young adults don't seem to make it to the beginning part of adulthood till they're about 30. So they might be at 30 where some of their peers might be at 21. Another thing I notice that can present challenges is people with autism are overrepresented in LGBTQ plus community. Now, that's not necessarily a problem, but while some people have a clear idea who they are, other people are in a kind of fuzzy limbo about it. And they say, well, I don't think I'm cisgender straight. I think I'm something else, but I don't know what it is. Or I think I'm this, but I don't want to be that. Or I'm not interested in all that. Or they're still exploring. I've had a lot of people who define themselves as asexual. So this is a mixed bag, and we definitely do not know enough about it. Older adults have expressed less of this, although it's probably more than what we see in the overall population. Young adults typically don't share the interests of their peers, which can be a barrier to socializing. And they may have unrealistic ideas about the dividing lines between work and leisure activities. So that can happen with older adults too. And of course, by the time any of these folks reach my office, they've had a lifetime of rejection, been bombarded with sensory stuff from a hostile environment. They have, delays in socialization, identity. They've got low self-esteem, and they aren't separated from their family. The older adults frequently come in when they have some crisis in their lives, or they've gotten to a place in their personal development where they really want to know what is all this that's been going on in my life. They may still lack some social skills, and they can actually benefit from psychotherapy, as can the younger people. There's some idea that psychotherapy can't help people with autism. It's not going to make the autism go away. That's just who they are. It can help people have an easier time responding to things without getting upset, modulating emotions, regulating themselves. It can help walk back years of trauma and other things, as well as teaching some ways to get around in the world that are going to be easier for them. A lot of people come in with a partner or spouse and they're struggling. And so this is an area that we frequently have to deal with. Many of my clients have trauma. What do I mean by trauma? Well, if you look in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, what you will see is the definition of PTSD involves having something that was life-threatening. Well, not everyone has something that's life-threatening in the sense of I was in a car accident, or I'm a veteran and I was in combat. Trauma can consist of witnessing your parent beat up your brother. It can be constant bombardment with negative messages over your life. It can be bullying. And trauma is definitely in the eye of the beholder. Just because one person had that experience and didn't come away traumatized doesn't mean another person won't get traumatized. And trauma has a lot of bad results that play out. So treating that can be extremely helpful and important. Okay. So people who have adapted, older people who have adapted to the world have often done some amazing things. And these people are my heroes because their lives, they didn't have any help. In fact, they usually had things holding them back. So the people who made lives for themselves, people who have jobs and people who have, families and things, have usually had to do a lot of what's called masking. And masking is a deliberate and effortful activity. It's like, I'm going to make sure that I look like I'm making eye contact with you. I'm going to make sure that I smile now and then. I'm going to make it sound as though I'm happy and excited to be here. Masking is a lot of work. And many people tell me it's frustrating, it's exhausting, and it makes them feel bad about themselves. And it's one reason for what gets called ASPE burnout, where the person gets partway through the workday and it's like, I can't take this anymore. But our good old sensory overwhelm and attentional demands can also be part of it. There's some research suggests that women are more successful at masking than most men are, but not always. And it also contributes to their being less likely to be diagnosed. However, in my clinic, I get about 40% of my adults coming in are women. Relationships, we don't know a whole lot about adult relationships in people with autism. We need more. There's a little bit of literature on marriage in autistic adults and their partners, but there is a lot to be learned about that. I do think understanding triggers, sensory triggers, the way the person responds to emotional disruption, and their needs for perhaps solitude or time away, things like that can be very helpful in a couple. A lot of autistic adults are going to continue to require some kind of support. That doesn't mean that they have to be in group homes. I don't mean that. I mean, they might need a psychotherapist or a program to help them, with job skills, and then maybe a support in their job. They may need medical interventions. But unfortunately, very few autistic adults get these unless they are intellectually disabled or they were diagnosed early. Aging families. I'm always distressed when I see a family of a middle-aged adult who lives at home and the parents may be 80 and they're still caring for their adult who is quite bright. I'm not blaming anybody. I understand how this happens, but there's risks with letting that happen, because at some point in families, the younger generation, the balance tips, and the younger generation has to take care of the older generation. So what's going to happen when the older generation becomes unable to take care of the younger generation? So that is a problem. So in general, I could make many conclusions, recommendations, and I could go on ranting a long time, but there really is a need for greater attention to the needs of late diagnosed people on spectrum. The public is maybe a little better educated about autism than formerly, but not much. There's still a lot of stereotypes out there, stigmatizing, there was a show called Love on the Spectrum recently. I have not seen it, but I am told that it kind of showed the young men involved in it in kind of the worst light, which is unfortunate. I do think self-advocacy is very important, and that autistic adults who have good lives should be role models and should help others by their example, and also perhaps directly. Health providers, I have a bee in my bonnet about health providers. They need to be aware that autistic adults might be very skilled at masking. And in fact, when I have to diagnose somebody, I have to ask a lot of strategic questions and do things to kind of get under the hood, as it were, to find out how the engine is working and find out what things were hard that they learned to mask. So it can be hard for someone who's not an expert to know about this, and they might dismiss them and say, oh, you don't have autism, you're just too social, you're creative, you make eye contact. Yeah. And of course, then the person gets dismissed. They should also be aware of medical illnesses that are common in people on the spectrum, and they should listen to people. I can't stress that enough. They need to listen to people with autism and give them time to express themselves. And very often, of course, providers are pressured for time, but this is a real need. We need to know why and how to provide medication treatments for people with autism, not just those for mental health treatments, although definitely those, but all kinds of medication. Why do people on the spectrum have different kinds of responses? And it's not all the same from person to person. So there's a lot of heterogeneity there, and we don't know why. It's also important that providers know that adults can benefit from psychotherapy, but we need to have more research on ways to adapt techniques for their needs and also to culturally adapt for people with autism from different cultural backgrounds. Employers have to be educated about the needs of people with autism in the workplace. I can't tell you how many strongly worded letters about, the rights of the individual with disabilities that I've had to write for various clients for their employers. I think there should be more ways to get into employment with some accommodations and maybe a gradual transition. UT Health is starting an internship program. We've already got one person who's done quite well, and I'm extremely proud of him, that is now working in IT security. But it's important to recognize that not everybody on the spectrum is an IT person. There's a stereotype about that. A lot of people are good at other things like art or music or writing. So we usually see our folks who are the engineer types on one end and the artist types on the other, and most people are more one than the other. So it can be harder to find employment for the people on the artist end. And programs to help people with autism need to take this into account too. And women, we really don't know enough about women with autism in general, but they're at high risk for late diagnosis and therefore not getting supports. And they're at high risk for abuse and other things. So their characteristics and needs require special attention. And of course, a goodly number of them become mothers. I'm thinking of having a group for autistic mothers one of these days, because they're really remarkable people. So thank you for listening. And this slide will show you my contact information down at the bottom. I will warn you that the clinic takes a long time to get in. If you're interested, we would love to hear from you, but it takes a long time to get in because there aren't enough people providing the service. So we're trying to train them as fast as we can. So thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Dr. Loveland. You shared a lot of really good information about autism and stuff that we hear about every day during, we have a social worker on staff and a small team that does navigating autism. And we definitely hear all of those things and all of those problems from autistic adults and families calling on behalf of other people. And so you definitely touched on a lot of good information. We've got a few questions, so I'm going to go ahead and read them out to you. And so first of all, how would you recommend, when you were talking about some of the executive functioning challenges, someone asked, how would you recommend that someone approach getting help with executive functioning challenges?
Good question. Executive functioning, we often see doctors treating it with medication for ADHD. For some people, that is very helpful. But there are other things too. For example, there's cognitive behavioral therapy for ADHD, which teaches skills of organizing and attending and doing things that will actually help the person get their life in order in a meaningful way. So there are things like that that can be very helpful. I can't hear you.
Thank you. Sorry, I put myself on mute while you were talking. So also, how would somebody know? We get this question a lot. I don't know if you can help them with this, but if somebody asked, how do they know if a psychologist is skilled in providing autism assessments for adults? What questions should I ask them? Like, how would somebody go around about finding a skilled psychologist to recognize autism? Because it is hard, and we know. I mean, we know as well that there's not a lot of professionals. There's a lot of people go undiagnosed and misdiagnosed
Yeah.
for a reason, so do you have any tips on for people trying to find a diagnostician in their area?
Well, ideally, I would look for somebody who this is their main thing, who has a great deal of experience. It's like if you were going to get your gallbladder out or have a heart bypass, you'd want somebody who'd done quite a few of those.
Yes.
So that's one thing I would say. Um, I would ask the person, um, you know, how much experience do you have relating with late diagnosis people? Because
Good question.
it isn't enough just to give some tests.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, that's great. And we also just at Autism Society maintain lists of diagnosticians that we know that have worked with adults or diagnosed women, and other kind of older adults or adolescents that have sometimes flown under the radar as well, with all of the problems that
Good.
you're saying, the misdiagnosis or the ADHD or whatever series of diagnoses they've already received. And then somebody asked, does the class clinic provide telehealth assessments? So do
We
you all?
sure do.
Okay, great. That's good to know. Let me see what other questions we have. Sorry, I'm reading them off. We've got like the Google form that people were filling out. Oh, okay. Here's another one. How would you go about telling your employer you have ASD, you have autism, if you're already employed? Do you have any suggestions for that?
Well, it may depend on what kind of work situation you have. Um, if you're planning to ask for some accommodations, which is usually the reason for disclosing, you may want to have a letter from your provider saying, yes, I saw so and so and I diagnosed her with this. And here are some areas in which I recommend she have accommodations, and she's entitled to these accommodations according to the law, and da da da. And that's one way to officially tell HR that you qualify for these. Some employers will want that. I would not give them an entire test report because it'll have too much information and that's private, and I wouldn't give that to them. Um, if it is a small company, it doesn't have an HR department, I might start by talking to my supervisor and saying, look, I've been diagnosed with this. This is what it means for me, and this is what it means for my job. Can you help me by allowing me to wear headphones at work, um, or change my work hours, rotate them, or whatever they might need?
Yeah, great. Okay, so yeah, kind of give them an overview of like how it might personally impact them, because most accommodations we find we have an employment program as well, and we've helped a lot about, and a lot of accommodations aren't that challenging to provide for most people, so
Hmm. Yeah.
it's pretty
And
easy.
sometimes it's just an attitude adjustment that has to happen. Like, I'm not being unfriendly with the other staff. I just can't take that much social interaction throughout the day.
Right, exactly. Okay, and then let me see what other questions we've got. Um, who would you recommend that people contact first if they believe they might be autistic? Do you have any recommendations for that? Like, what would be their first call or their first step?
Well, if we're talking about an adult,
Hmm.
they, I mean, I would start with a psychologist who is familiar with this and can perform testing. Um, Therapists like LCSW, LPC, and LMFT um, do not provide testing. Psychiatrists do not provide testing. Um, Psychiatrists are great if you are dealing with severe mental illness, however, and you need medication, because that is principally what psychiatrists do these days. And there's some very fine ones, but most of them are not trained to diagnose something that requires a great deal of deep dive into symptoms because they don't have the time for it.
Hmm. Okay, great, thank you. And then let's see. Okay, somebody asked, how do different modalities like CBT, like guess, cognitive behavior therapy compared to modalities like somatic and art therapy work with and affects someone with ASD? So I
Okay, well, I use all those things.
okay, great. Okay.
CBT, being cognitive behavioral therapy, works primarily on that level, the level of cognition, and my thoughts drive my feelings, drive my behaviors, and that's very helpful. And it's actually a very flexible technique that can be applied for a whole bunch of things. However, um, it, uh, there are sometimes a need for treatment of trauma or things that can't easily be verbalized. And so some of those more physiologically based things like somatic experiencing or EMDR, which is kind of in between those, you know, can be used to address trauma. And I find them to be very helpful. There's sometimes when I mean, there are trauma treatments that are cognitive too, and those can be very effective in the right hands. But sometimes people don't want to do that, and so with some of the physiological things, you don't have to explain the whole narrative of your trauma and rehearse it. But you have to deal with it, but in a different way. So what I'm saying is I like all of them.
Okay. Okay. Good to
Yeah,
know.
but they're for different things.
Yeah. Okay, that's good to know. All right. And then we've got just a couple more questions. Somebody asked, what can someone with social anxiety keep in mind when trying to distinguish which characteristics could be autistic and which could be general anxiety disorder or generalized anxiety disorder?
Okay, that's a good question. I even get that question from psychiatrists sometimes. Doesn't that person just have social anxiety? Well, if you've been going through the world and having trouble relating to people and getting negative feedback from people, it's hardly surprising that you have social anxiety. Social anxiety involves being afraid to interact with people because you're afraid you're going to be judged or criticized or rejected. Um, and a lot of my clients do have that. Um, I think it is a byproduct of having autism. It's not part of having autism. Um, a lot of them have general anxiety too. Why is this? Well, sometimes people get hyper focused on ideas. That can be one reason. Um, I've had people who were worried about weather, for example, and it's not that weather can't be a danger. Anyone who lives in Texas knows that. But if you're focusing on it all the time and it's interfering with your ability to do other things, then that's a problem. So most people get anxious sometimes, but if your anxiety is not just social, but it's about other things, it might be free floating. There are people who just wake up in the morning and they're anxious and they don't know why. And it's like if their anxiety were a glass of water, it would be this far from the top and you don't have to add much for it to boil over. So sometimes when the anxiety is treated, the person's quality of life goes way up because it's like you took out a barrier and they can now see a horizon. I hope that addresses the question.
Yeah, that helps. Thank you. And then let me see. Let's see. Okay. We also had a question. So somebody asked, like in the middle of your presentation, what is the difference between autism phenotype and ASD?
Okay, well, we in the medical area, we talk about genotype and phenotype. So genotype is what your genetic code says. And phenotype is what actually comes out as the end product because your genes can be turned on and off by various experiences and so forth. And so what we produce or what we observe even at any given time is a phenotype. And sometimes people's genes are activated by things and things change, but that's their phenotype, how it was actually realized in the person. I don't know whether someone is using autism phenotype in a special way. but some people say broader autism phenotype. And by that, I think they mean people who have subclinical features of autism. And I see these people too, people who don't quite meet the criteria. Maybe they don't have quite all of the things, or they have them, but they're not severe enough in some areas. And so we don't give the diagnosis in that case. We say, well, this person doesn't meet the criteria, but they have some features, including A, B, and C, and we think that they might benefit from this kind of treatment or that, which may overlap what is needed by people who meet the full definition.
Okay, great, thank you. And I think that's really all the questions now. So thank you so much for being so thorough and answering all of this and explaining, so much about autism and diagnosis. Really helpful. And then, oh wait, do we have one more question? Hold on, sorry. I think, let's see. Oh, wait, no, we got it. Okay, last question.
Okay.
Okay, I missed this. Sorry, I was scrolled up. We'll do one more question here. Oh no, we've got 2 questions. Okay, do you have time for 2 more questions?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. I missed these. So it says, what are your thoughts of diagnosis only happening when they are negatively affecting a person's life rather than having a more proactive stance of diagnosing before someone experiences challenges? How is this connected to the masking and mirroring that many people with ASD develop as coping to be sort of functional, and the burnout that people develop because of that? This is a lot of questions. How is ASD different in different cultural backgrounds, and how does that affect diagnosis? So that was multiple questions.
Well, let me start with that last one. ASD is ASD. However, how people think about it, what it means to them, what it means to their families, what kind of treatments they will accept or be interested in, what their goals are, what their challenges are, can vary by culture. For example, in certain cultures, it's not at all unusual for an unmarried person to live with their family until they get married, even if they're 35. So you got to know things like that. Now, going back to the other part, remind me, what was the first part of it?
Yeah, so they said, what are your thoughts of diagnosis only happening
Okay.
when they are negatively affecting a person rather than having a more proactive stance of diagnosing someone before they experience some of the challenges? And how's that connected to masking and mirroring and burnout?
Okay, so ideally, we'd like to diagnose everybody in childhood. And the way that we know that there's a problem, a condition that we want to call it that, is because there's something happening that is negative for the person. If it's not negative for the person, then it's just there. Like I said, everybody has anxiety sometimes, but unless your anxiety is getting so big it's interfering with your life, we don't call it a diagnosable condition. So, it's clear that some people have problems that are hard for them and have been making trouble for them, but they've learned to work around it. Those people I want to get as early as possible. So it isn't whether they're masking or not. It's what are they under the hood, So if under the hood X wasn't really a problem, I mean, there was some tendency toward, let's say, hyperfocus, but not enough to interfere with other things, and there never was, then we know that part is not there. But if we have somebody who can now pull themselves away from preferred interests to do things that they need to do, say at work, but it's not natural to them, and so they have to effortfully do it, it's making a problem for them. So even if they're doing okay at work, you see, it's still a problem. I hope that it makes sense.
No, definitely. It can definitely take a toll on your mental health. And, as you listed all of the problems of not, being undiagnosed as well. And, we definitely see that. So.
But I also don't want it to sound like, oh my God, all these problems. Well, there are problems. But I also think the good news is that we are seeing more and more people with autism who are living their lives, who have good jobs, who have families. And, I often have people come in and say, I'm a complete mess. And I'll say, well, you're not a complete mess. You finished your education, you have a good job that you like, and you have a partner, a stable partner. You have a bunch of life tasks right there, or you got this and that, you know. So people need to give themselves credit, because very often this is achieved at a cost.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, and kind of along those lines, another person asked, what should an adult woman seeking diagnosis keep in mind in terms of presenting differently or masking differently? So I'm not sure if they're thinking they're masking and they're going in for a diagnosis. They may be concerned they're not
Mm.
going to be seen as autistic. I'm not quite.
Yeah,
I'm not
well,
sure
we
how I
do
feel.
have that problem. We get people who come in and they look just great, and it's because they have practiced these skills so long that they don't know how to drop them,
Mm-hmm.
but it's still effortful.
Mm-hmm.
And uh, what happens, it's remarkable for me, is when I get to know a person better. Sometimes it'll happen by the end of the initial interview. Sometimes it's if I'm seeing them in therapy and I really get to know them, they'll drop the masking and I get to see the real person. And that's great. I'm glad when I can see that, because then I know I've really got a rapport with them. But in order to get under the hood for people who come in for diagnosis who have a lot of masking going on, I'll ask targeted questions, and I go, I'm very direct about certain things, because being sideways or oblique or subtle is not very helpful.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, and obviously too, I'm sure anyone going in for a diagnosis is experiencing problems if they've gotten to the point where they're seeking a diagnosis. So hopefully we often tell parents write down everything that's going on. You know what I mean? Even if you think it's not important, like does your kid have a food problem or a problem with clothes? Like literally, list everything. So maybe that would
Yeah,
be.
I have adults who do that too. They'll come in with a spreadsheet or a list or a narrative. And
Mhm.
that's actually very helpful, because sometimes when they get into the interview, they might forget something because maybe they're nervous, although we try really hard to put them at ease.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. Between the masking or the nerves or the anxiety, it could be hard. I'm sure it's hard to seek a diagnosis as an adult. But this has been really, really helpful. That really is the end of the questions. I'm sorry I missed those last two, but we did want to make sure to ask those while we have
Okay,
you.
wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, so that wraps up our presentation. So this will be on Facebook. We'll also put it on our YouTube channel. Dr. Loveland has graciously said she can share the slides. And we also, as I know Leslie put it in the chat, but we're available to help as well. We do maintain a list of diagnosing professionals, and we can also help you navigate through insurance, or if you don't have insurance or whatever the case may be, we can try to help you kind of navigate the whole system, which is a lot to figure out. So please feel free to contact us. Our next presentation, seminars across the spectrum, we actually have Texas Able coming to talk about tax advantage savings accounts for there's a lot of benefits for autistic adults as well as families of kids with autism. And they also have a debit card that we have a lot of adults with disabilities using to kind of give them more independence. So that's been really helpful for some people. So they'll be talking about that on November 10th. And I also just wanted to mention our film festival is this Sunday in Austin, our Fest Texas Autism Film Festival. And today is actually the last day to buy tickets. So that's on our website and also on our Facebook page. So if you'd like to join us, get your ticket before the end of the night. So that is it. And Dr. Loveland, thank you so much for joining. I'm going to end this now. We're going to wrap up on Facebook here and stop the live stream. But thanks to everybody for
Bye.
joining us. And thank